Hi there and welcome. Is it time then for the UK to adopt a 5-day-long isolation period and start getting back to normal? All of the newspaper front pages that touched on COVID this morning, it's worth saying, rang a very positive note. We're going to share some of them with you in just a second. Ministers were quoted calling for more relaxed measures in some, and others focused on the NHS not coming under the levels of strain. Many of the more, well, I think it's probably fair to say, alarmist at time modellers claimed it would ahead of Christmas. Overall, the mood seems to have shifted, a change in the epidemiological wind, perhaps. Going, gone. At last, some good news as COVID cases start to fall, headlined the often cautious Metro. The iPaper's front page went like this: PM expected to announce living with COVID plan, with the article claiming the new, more optimistic strategy was expected to be revealed in weeks. The Times, self-styled paper of record, meanwhile said, we'll avoid COVID crisis, says upbeat NHS chiefs. Well, some of you believe the media focuses excessively on downbeat media medical chiefs. So this one stood out for you. There is Daily Telegraph leading with Sunak backs call for 5-day isolation period. Even The Guardian actually ran a headline quoting the Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, saying, quote, the UK should be a pioneer for living with COVID. So is there now a gathering consensus that we are moving from a pandemic to an endemic of a milder form of the virus, a milder variant of the virus? And if this is a new living with COVID creed, will that translate into a cut in those self-isolation periods that are started this afternoon with? Joining me now, Dr. Laurence Buckman, a former chairman of the British Medical Association's GPs Committee. Doctor, thanks so much for your time today. Very much appreciate it. Almost as we've been speaking, actually, just a shade under, a few minutes ago, I read in Scotland, and this I quote this to underline my point, rather. In Scotland, latest data out for COVID, 24 hours, 11,827 new cases, but no deaths. I wonder how much of a story that tells.
I think it's the promising beginning of what is likely to be the evidence that coronavirus is now moving from pandemic to endemic phase. We haven't got the evidence yet. As for a 5-day shortening from 7 days for a quarantine period, we haven't got any evidence to back that up yet. But I suspect that over the next few weeks we will. So the apparent report of Boris Johnson saying there'll be a plan for living with COVID from March sounds to me to be realistic.
As part of that plan to live with COVID, where do you stand on the, I was going to say vexed question, I mean, it is a question of whether there ought to be fourth and subsequent booster jabs?
There is no evidence presently to support a fourth jab. There are countries around the world that are giving a fourth jab, and I'm not quite sure what evidence they're basing that on. But all the reports I've seen suggest that 3, for the moment, is enough. Now, if we found that antibody levels and T-cell protection diminished over the next 6 months, say, then we might have to reconsider a booster. And we might well end up with flu jabs and COVID jabs annually. That I can see that could well be a forward move. But we can't say that yet. We've got no evidence to back that up.
Israel, wasn't it? Israel who've pioneered the fourth booster jab. I mean, one of the good things, I suppose, if we can talk about the fight against COVID, is that when you've got so many different approaches, I mentioned that apropos Israel, you've got so many different nations, so many different sets of medical procedures and attitudes, all coming to bear on different variants. I mean, that is kind of a silver lining, isn't it?
Yeah, so it certainly gives you a plethora of evidence. There's lots to go on. And for the moment, the question for Israel, for example, is whether antibody immunity, which is what they're trying to boost with a fourth jab, or T-cell immunity, which is your body's own inbuilt protection, which goes sniffing out coronavirus, whether you need antibodies and T-cells or you can manage with one or the other. At the moment, the Israeli plan is you have to have antibodies, and that is a completely reasonable approach. But we don't have the evidence to show that the alternative, which is to wait and see what happens next, whether that would be better, and certainly would be cheaper and would be easier And we will all have a fourth dose, say, in a year's time. I mean, we just don't know. I don't think we're many weeks away from having a pretty clear idea of where COVID is going. It certainly looks like, with evidence you just reported from Scotland, that as the death rate falls, the endemic nature of what will become a relatively less serious illness is rising. And I think we may reach the point where we can say, OK, let's move to 5 days. I don't think we're there yet, but we're not far off.
Part of the problem here is that, yes, this is a kind of global laboratory in real time. But if this were a laboratory experiment, people wouldn't be dying in the numbers they have died. I just come back to, you mentioned the 5-day period. I mean, that is another illustration, isn't it, of the diversity of approach that's taken. I mean, the Americans at times have been pretty draconian in some of their attitudes. On the 5-day self-isolation period, rather less so. But it's not as if lots of countries are stampeding behind them to follow their lead. People, by this stage, it feels internationally, have decided they know what their national approach is to COVID and managing their particular problems.
Yes, it depends how you view the fact that 10 to 30% of people on the 6th day are still infectious. If you say, well, it's a minor illness, we've got to live with it, then OK, and I can see pressing economic arguments for making it 5 days. However, if you say that 30% still infectious at 6 days is too much and risks too much ill health in the community, whether that ill health is very serious or quite serious, I don't think you're yet in a position to make a judgment on 5 days. As I say, I don't think that's a long way away. It's just not quite yet. Maybe 2-3 weeks, something like that, we'll have a pretty clear idea. Certainly if death rates fall to next to nothing, that's going to be a very clear indication that having infection on day 6 probably is not quite so crucial in the Omicron world, unless, of course, we'd find another variant to get worried about.
Dr. Laurence Buckman, as ever, thanks very much indeed for your time.